Old Testament Basics, Lesson 3, Color Books, Wisdom Poetry Books, and Prophetic Books. In Lesson 2, we looked at the Old Testament's main storyline and focused on the 11 books from Genesis to Nehemiah that tell the Old Testament story. In doing so, we got the big picture of the Old Testament history, but we also left out a lot of detail. In this lesson, we're going to add some of that detail into the story, and we do that by plugging in what we call the color books. You will recall that the color books stop the forward movement of the story and provide still shots that add more details to the story told in the time books. We're also going to see where Israel's poetry and wisdom books fit into the story. It's important to know what books are included and when they were written. And then we'll plug in the prophets and see when they lived and ministered. We need that historical background so we can more clearly understand their prophetic messages. Because we went through the Old Testament's storybook in our previous lesson, we can now place the rest of the books into the narrative and see how they contribute to the story. We'll survey the color books first. We begin with the book of Job because Job was a contemporary of Abraham and chronologically is the first of the color books. So when you think of Abraham's story in Genesis 12, that's where Job fits into the timeline. But since Job doesn't move the biblical storyline forward, we include it with the color books. Job's book wrestles with the difficult question of why good people suffer. He didn't have the Old Testament law to guide him when he lived hundreds of years before Moses' time. That's important to understand when you read his story, because Job's view of God was not based on the kind of knowledge people had after God gave Moses the law. Yet he worshiped God faithfully. His book gives us additional insight into life in Abraham's time, and we integrate his story with Abraham's. The second color book is Leviticus. Notice the first 4 letters in the book's name, and you get a clue about its content. Levi was the tribe God appointed to serve the priestly functions in the tabernacle, and so this book that outlines all of Israel's religious practices is appropriately named Leviticus. The book explains in detail how the priests conducted Israel's religious life at the tabernacle. So we place Leviticus next to the book of Exodus. When you think of Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments and God's law, that's where the book of Leviticus belongs. Deuteronomy is the third color book. Like Job and Leviticus, it doesn't move the history forward, but it brings great insight into a particular period in Israel's history. Deuteronomy fits between the book of Numbers, which records Israel's wandering in the wilderness, and the book of Joshua, which tells us about Israel's conquest of Canaan. In Deuteronomy, Moses reissued the law that he gave Israel at Sinai. Remember that the people who were going into Canaan were not the same people who came out of Egypt. There was a 40-year gap between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Joshua. Moses made sure this generation knew their lives were to be governed by God's law. So Deuteronomy fits into the narrative between Numbers and Joshua. The next color book occurs almost a century after Deuteronomy. The book of Lamentations fits into the sad story at the end of 2 Kings.